Welcome. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists, colleagues, and friends. This has been an exciting day, and we're happy to continue our inaugural activities for the new building, the UW Center for Civic Engagement, with an exciting program entitled Contemporary American Democracy, Perils and Promises. My name is Eric Giordano. I'm the interim director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, and we are very grateful to be co-sponsoring this activity with the UW Marathon County campus. And we'd like to thank Dean Smith for her support of this programming. The Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service is a component of the UW College and UW Extension. And I'd like to welcome in the audience our Chancellor and Provost, Greg Lampe, Chancellor Mark Van Kettkrix, Provost Lampe, and other distinguished guests. I'm not going to take too much time here except to thank very quickly the WIPS interns and staff who helped put this together, the UW Marathon County staff, the Ambassador Corps that's helped out tonight, and of course our technical crew, Chris Berg and others. Thank you so much for your help tonight. We'd like to ask you at this time to please turn off your electronic devices that might interfere with our flight and sit back and enjoy, enjoy the activities tonight. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce our moderator, and he will then introduce the panelists. Our moderator tonight is a man who has received appropriate recognition today for helping to make this building reality. Former campus dean and CEO of UW Marathon County, Jim Veninga. Jim also, in his previous existence, was the head of the Texas Humanities Council, and he also has written numerous articles and books on the topic of liberal education and the importance of liberal education in addressing public issues and achieving civil discourse in society through the humanities and liberal education generally. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to present Jim Veninga.
Thank you. Thank you all and welcome. Let me thank Eric for the absolutely fantastic job and the staff of WIPS. WIPS is just 3 years old, but it has done just an incredible amount of programming in that period of time. And I think Eric and the staff of WIPS deserve our deepest appreciation and a round of applause. The Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service has certainly greatly expanded its programming in the past year or so, and it has been able to do so thanks to the support of UW Colleges and UW Extension, but also through the very generous support of a number of foundations and corporations, organizations, and individuals. Of special importance, I believe, have been a number of timely grants from the Wisconsin Humanities Council, which has also provided some funding for the program this evening. The Wisconsin Humanities Council is a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It supports public programs in the humanities, including the recently completed Wisconsin Book Festival. And with us this evening are Director Dina Wartzel, and past board chairs Carla Mullen from Watertown and John Hansen from Ashland, and I would like the three of them to stand so we can thank the Wisconsin Humanities Council for what it has done to help launch this enormous enterprise of both the building and, indeed, WIPS. Could you stand, please? Well, our goal this evening is to explore the health of American democracy. Many writers and commentators have noted the loss of civility, honesty, and common decency in our public discourse, in what at times seems to be excessive partisanship and inability to want or to find common ground and to get things done, whether in our local communities, our state houses, or in Washington, D.C. USA Today recently interviewed 3 senators and 3 House members who were leaving public service, Republicans and Democrats alike, to ask their views about the health of politics in the Capitol. And reporter Kathy Keeley noted, quote, "Spanning the continent and the political spectrum, all sounded strikingly similar themes. Whether they retired voluntarily or had retirement thrust upon them by voters, they worried about the increasing polarization of politics and the decreasing opportunities for bipartisanship and genuine debate as opposed to bumper sticker sloganeering." So this evening, we are taking a break from a very heated political season to gain some objectivity and a longer and deeper view of American democracy, and to think about new ways in which citizens can be involved in public life and how democratic practices can be strengthened. The Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service has established a relationship with the Kettering Foundation in Dayton, Ohio. And that foundation, which is an independent and nonpartisan research organization, has a very specific focus for all of its work. And it revolves around a question, and the question is, what does it take for democracy to work as it should? What does it take for democracy to work as it should? So our goal this evening is to explore ways in which key political practices, how we practice self-governance, sustaining the government of, by, and for the people can be strengthened. As you know, various organizations and institutions and communities influence those democratic practices. And the health of those communities and institutions obviously weigh very heavily on the well-being of democracy. And I'm referring, of course, to our schools, colleges and universities, to religious communities, to nonprofit organizations, governments at all levels, special interest groups, small and large businesses, and of course the media. Thus we can ask the question, how are these communities, these organizations, these institutions, how are they shaping contemporary democracy? Where do we find forces right now that tend to unite rather than divide? And what more can be done to ensure citizens who are knowledgeable, community-oriented, and able to participate in the public life of their communities and the nation itself? And I would highlight, especially given this new magnificent facility, what ought colleges and universities do to further prepare students for full and active citizenship. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I know some of them were introduced this afternoon, but I'm going to reintroduce them to you because we have many people here tonight who were not at the program this afternoon. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. We will reserve time for questions and answers and responses at the end of their presentations. Our first speaker this evening will be Jim Leach. He is a former congressman from Iowa on the Republican side of the aisle. He served from 1977 to 2007. He is the current chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, appointed by President Obama. And NEH, by the way, is an independent, nonpartisan, grant-making agency of the U.S. government that supports research and education and preservation and public programs in the humanities. His concern for the restoration of civility in our public dialogue has been a hallmark of his administration. In January of this year, he launched a 50-state civility tour promoting a return to decency and civility in our public dialogue. Congressman Leach has taught at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. He holds an MA degree with graduate work in Soviet politics from the Johns Hopkins University. And I should add that he also chaired the Congressional Humanities Caucus, which has been very supportive of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And let me note as well, very important point here, that he was a star athlete in college and was elected to the Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and the International Wrestling Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa. So, in case there's any incivility here this evening, we are indeed very well protected. Dave Obey has represented the 7th Congressional District in Congress since 1969 on the Democratic side of the aisle and is current chair of the House Committee on Appropriations. Congressman Obey will be retiring at the end of the present term. Along with his wife, Joan, Mr. Obey attended UW-Marathon County before transferring to UW-Madison, where he received BS and MA degrees with graduate work in Soviet politics. It's really interesting. We see the influence of the Cold War here, that both Congressman Leach and Congressman Obey were engaged at graduate level, preparing for academic careers, I do believe, in both cases, dealing with the Soviet Union. Mr. Obey is the author of an autobiography, Raising Hell for Justice, The Washington Battles of a Heartland Progressive, which was published by the University of Wisconsin Press in 2008. And his commitment to higher education and to students, I think, has been evident throughout his career, and certainly we've seen that here in his interaction with this campus. He's a founding member of the bluegrass band, the Capitol Offenses, that's Capitol with an O, which has recorded 3 albums, and maybe there will be more to come here soon. Barbara Lawton has served 2 terms as Wisconsin's lieutenant governor. She is chair of the Wisconsin Arts Board, serves on the National Leadership Council for the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and in that capacity has led Wisconsin's efforts to champion the deep public value of the liberal arts and higher education for students, but also for the nation as a whole, a nation that is increasingly dependent upon cultural and intellectual capital and creativity. She's also a founding member of the advisory board for the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, the only board that she said she was going to sit on during her term as lieutenant governor, we learned today. And she holds a master's degree in Spanish from UW-Madison. Brad Karger is the county administrator, as you all know. This position functions as the CEO of a public organization with 750 employees and an annual budget that I believe is around $170 million. He's focused extensively on organizational performance, staff development, and increased accountability for outcomes in a number of very strategic areas. And he, too, is a founding member of the advisory board of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. And Brett Barker is an associate professor of history here at UW-Marathon County. He received his PhD in history from UW-Madison. He's been here since 2002. His research is focused on the Northern Civil War home front, and he is particularly interested in the political culture of the Midwest during the Civil War, and he's published extensively in that area. He was the recipient of the UW College's Chancellor's Excellence Award in Teaching in 2007, and this year he's an honoree of UW-Marathon County's Distinguished Faculty Society. In addition to teaching, thinking about civic engagement here, he is also deeply involved in public activities as a project director of the Wisconsin Academy for the Study of American History, which is a K through 16 collaboration funded by the Department of Education Teaching American History grant, a very significant grant, and project manager for the Central Wisconsin Digitization Project, and he also serves on the local county historical society board of trustees. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to this great evening and to the fun of this conversation. And I believe we will begin with Chairman Jim Leach.
Well, thank you, Jim. Let me just begin with an observation. David and I were walking over, and we thought we might begin with a real fight because we wanted to show you what Congress was really like. But the real secret is that, at least from my perspective, with not near as long service as David, I only served 30 years, David, But in observing the Congress, you get to know people and you get to watch people, even those you don't know. And we have this term of art called high regard. But those that one holds in particularly high regard, I found that were in about equal proportions. Some were conservative, some were liberal, some were moderate. And those I held in less high regard, some were conservative, some were liberal, and some were moderate. But if there is a little category of highest regard, that would be an enclave that David Ovey would fit. And I think all of you are to be congratulated for 42 years of great judgment. I've been touring the country talking about civility, and in some ways there's no duller subject to think about. But today is a remarkable day, and I thought I might mention something about it. I'm hopeful if someone can raise their hand at some point, they can help us out. With 1 minute to go, the Badgers were up 31-30 over the Hawkeyes. And I'm confident or hopeful that truth and justice will prevail in the end. But if anyone hears the final score, yes, sir, what can you tell us? What was the score? 31-30. That means the Badgers prevailed. Okay, fair enough. Well, I know that each of you were sitting on the edges of your chair, and so you might as well get the issues of life resolved. In any regard, if we go to the American political circumstance, there are a lot of words being thrown about, sometimes unthinkingly and sometimes perhaps too thinkingly, because words reflect emotion as well as reason. And I sometimes observe to people that the difference between Dick Cheney and Barack Obama is that Dick was called a fascist, and Barack's been called a fascist and a communist, sometimes at the same time by the same people. And we also have introduced a word that we all have read about all our lives, and I will tell you is surprisingly live, particularly in some regions of the country, but a little bit everywhere. It's the first time in my memory that people started to use the word secession. And these are bizarre thoughts because they're ahistorical. If one truly thinks that they ought to secede from the country or their state should, we thought we resolved that issue in the Civil War, and if you think of fascism and communism, and you apply it to someone, what does it mean? I mean, these are doctrines that involve gulags and concentration camps, and one might think, what's wrong with a little bit of hyperbole? And the answer is truly plenty, because some frameworks of thoughts are designed to reflect rival ideas, and other frameworks imply enemy. And implying enemy not only implies a perspective, but it also implies the possibility of violence, and that 400,000 Americans gave their lives to defeat fascism, tens of thousands to hold communism at bay, and the Civil War was all about making meaningful the Declaration of Independence. And so these are thoughts in the land that people should be concerned about. I have a friend who's a professor at the University of South Carolina, and his field is rhetoric. And under a MacArthur Fellowship, he has been studying for the last decade a word. And the word is reconciliation, in which he has been studying the South African Revolution. And the interesting aspect of it is that he says at the beginning of this great change, which everyone in the world kind of knew would have to happen, but all of us that followed South Africa assumed would happen in a very bloody way, happened rather peacefully. And it happened in partial measure because with tremendous reluctance, both sides started to use the word reconciliation, which they kind of knew the meaning of, and they didn't intend. The whites very much looked down upon African blacks, and the African blacks not only resented, but have profound grievances against the whites. And yet when both sides started to use the word reconciliation, suddenly a possibility of a compromise came about, and then a word that had meaning came to have new and different meaning with acts. And so it's an example of, in this case, a mouthful of a word being used very constructively in a uplifting kind of way. Now, in our history, when you think of words, there are words that come from, let's say, the Declaration of Independence, from Lincoln's second inaugural, when he said that this country ought to seek reconciliation with malice towards none and charity for all. Those are really uplifting kinds of words, and so we have a choice of that kind of rhetoric or other kinds of rhetoric. And at this time, one of the troubles with divisive words is that we're in a very divisive time, and we see this economically. I mentioned very briefly earlier today, we have these two what philosophers call paradigms of thought in economics. You have a real theoretical model set forth by John Maynard Keynes that talks about in difficult times, it's correct to borrow and stimulate, and you have a model set by Milton Friedman, that these are times that one should be very cautious about higher taxes and great borrowing, and that one should manipulate a federal central bank principally. And both these models are quite credible. The problem is that if you take politics, how does one resolve it? And how do people come together? And isn't the great issue coming up likely to be after an election where there's a great deal of division, in which people have to come together and work things out? And the only thing worse than either model is the notion that one can't reach agreement. And that is something that all of us have to think seriously through. And process matters, and it's more than the democratic process. I used to say that process was our most important product, and then one starts to think, what is process? And it involves far more than simply how we do things. Now, one thing, David and I were often on the other side of issues, but I guarantee you, and I haven't talked to David about this, the one thing we totally agree with is that the Senate doesn't have things right. And we sometimes use stronger descriptions than that. But beyond that, underlying processes is feelings of can you come together with some sort of ability of goodwill. One of the most difficult things that I've ever seen in a political science poll, and I've never heard this question asked, was about a month ago. Some national polling organization asked the American public, do you believe that your elected official should ever compromise? And 52% of the people said no. Well, politics in some ways is the art of compromise. There's nothing more dangerous than certitude. In fact, if one thinks it through, human error is part of the human condition, and the best and the brightest can make mistakes, perhaps less than the less bright and the less brightest, but the fact is that these are times that one has to assume that everybody can learn something from somebody else. And so I would just conclude with the observation, because my party once had a contract with America, I think both parties today ought to have a contract that indicates they're willing to work with the other side. Thank you all very much.
Welcome to church. I notice you're all sitting in the back, which is what people usually do in church. I'm really pleased to have Jim Leach here today. Jim, as he said, served for 30 years in the Congress. And in all of that time, regardless of how people felt about his position on issues, I never heard anyone question his motives. and I never heard anyone question his decency. And he, I think, in many ways was seen as one of the people in the House who made up its collective conscience. And the country is better off for his having served in public life, not just his own district, not just his own state, but everyone. One of my dearest friends in the world is John Hume. John was the leader of the peace forces in Northern Ireland. He was a Catholic. And in the model of Martin Luther King, he began to protest the fact that almost 70% of Catholic males in Northern Ireland were jobless by virtual design of government policy. And John decided to try to do something about that in a peaceful way, as Martin Luther King tried to change this country in a peaceful way. And his reward for his efforts was that he was twice beaten badly by the Protestant forces in Northern Ireland. He laid down in front of a tank once, and his wife thought he was a dead man, and fortunately the tank stopped. But he was also the victim of assassination attempts, I think, 9 times, by both sides. By the Protestants because they didn't want to change, and by the Catholics because he was one of theirs and he was seeking a peaceful resolution of matters, and they didn't want that. The IRA didn't want it. And he later received the Nobel Prize for peace, and he's now out of government, out of politics. But he was in my office once, and he said, "David, for the life of me, I do not understand the attitude of your countrymen when it comes to politics. Don't they understand that politics is the peaceful substitute for war?" And that is really, in many ways, what it is. Certainly internationally, and in many ways domestically as well. There are 2 questions that we were asked to address tonight. One, in an earlier letter that we received, was how do we deal with the decline of civility in this country? And the second is what has to happen for democracy to succeed? I'd like to take just a moment on the first question first. I've always felt up until now that we're not necessarily seeing a decline in civility. I felt that it is probably just a cyclical thing, because after all, when I got into politics, was in the middle of the Joe McCarthy era. And I don't think we would suggest that was particularly civil. In fact, the greatest teacher I ever had, Art Henderson, who was my junior high school history teacher, his life was virtually destroyed by forces on the Wausau School Board who tried to have him fired for being a communist. And he was about as red as Red Skelton. And that just was an example of how incivil politics could be at that time. And I would use as another example, when I went to the Congress in '69, it was at the height of the Vietnam War. And in those days, what I call the haters were on the left in our caucus. And even if you opposed the Vietnam War, if you differed with them on tactics or strategy, there was something morally defective about you, and something not quite right, and some of them would shun you. And today they're largely gone. And now, on the other end of the cycle, we see that same kind of conduct on the part of the far right. And so if you're a moderate Republican, you take your life in your hands if you try to work across the aisle. Marge Ruckema found that out the hard way from Connecticut. Mike Castle just found it out in the Delaware primary, Tom Petri from the state. Tom and I have been in opposite parties for as long as we've known each other, but we're good friends. And Tom was twice passed over to be chairman of first the Transportation Committee and then the Education and Labor Committee because he got along too well with the other side of the aisle and was not believed to be sufficiently partisan. So I think it's been largely cyclical, sometimes in one party more than the other, sometimes in the other party. But I think something is changing on that score, and I'll get back to that at the end of my remarks. Secondly, when we ask what needs to happen in this democracy in order to make democracy work, I think you have to divide that up into two questions. What do the practitioners need to do? And then what does the general public need to do? And I would say that with the practitioners, the first thing that you need to do is to have a determination to put substance, at least occasionally, ahead of politics. Now, when I went to the Congress, I would say that that body was 50% political and 50% legislative. Today, unfortunately, I think it's become 90% political. Now, one of the reasons for that is simply that it's become more competitive. When I first went to Congress, it was generally assumed the Democrats would control year after year. That changed in '94. And really, since the early 90s, it's become much more partisan, and I think a function of that is simply the fact that both sides see every issue as being maybe the issue that could decide control of the House. And so people are willing to stretch the rubber band in terms of what kind of practices they will tolerate in order to win. Then I would also say that, as Jim points out, we need accountability in the system. And the problem with the Senate rules is that they destroy accountability. I am so tired of having to explain to my constituents why, if you get a majority of the votes in the Senate, you don't win. And I'm also, frankly, tired of the ability of individual senators to engage in what is called an anonymous hold, in which a senator can hold up action on any piece of legislation anonymously, just to try to get his way. And that, I've had senators say, oh, keep your nose out of our business. The Senate rules are our business. No, not when they reflect upon the entire body, not when they discourage the entire country, and not when they wind up obstructing what we have been able to do through the House. The kind of politics I believe in is that if you're in the minority, you have a right to define your differences with the majority. But then you also have an obligation procedurally not to stand in the way of the majority's being able to put its program through. And that's what I tried to do in the years when I was the senior Democrat on the Appropriations Committee. I probably voted for about half the appropriation bills that they passed through, and I probably opposed half of them. And when I opposed them, I would fight like the devil to define my objections. But then I would procedurally sit down with them and work out time limits on debate, persuade members to drop duplicative amendments. And I did that not because I was such a good guy, but because I thought the content of the bills was so lousy that the sooner we could pass them, the sooner the public would see that, and it would inure to our side. Now, my political judgment may have been right or wrong, but I think you have got to give the majority an opportunity to get its basic obligations done for the year. That doesn't mean you have to cooperate on something that you think is absolutely outrageous for the country. But there isn't anything very partisan about highways, not anything very partisan about law enforcement. And on those issues, you ought to be able to come together. When I was chairman of the committee the first time in '94, we passed every appropriation bill on time before the end of the fiscal year because I sat down with Joe McDade, the minority leader on the committee, and I said, Joe, We may not be able to agree on the details of each of these bills, but at least maybe we can agree on how much money will go into each of the 12 bills that we had to pass. And he agreed to that, and that's why we got our work done. In the last 2 years, it's been a very different attitude. And I want to compare two things. People say, gee, why don't you just all get along? After 9/11, Dennis Hastert, the Speaker of the House, brought us together in his office. We had a huge fight within the Republican Party about how to proceed, and we also had some rather major differences between the two parties. And Hastert made everybody sit in that room until about 1 o'clock in the morning until they had worked out their differences, and we'd agreed on a $20 billion package to bolster our homeland security efforts around the country. Compare that to what I ran into when we tried to put together the recovery package a year ago. And I called the opposite leadership in and told them, I said, look, I would like to know what you'd like to see in the bill and what you'd like to have out of the bill. I can't guarantee that we can accommodate you, but I would at least like to try. And the response I got back was, sorry, but I've got instructions. We can't play. So in other words, no matter what we produced, it was going to be opposed. Jim mentioned compromise. I want to read something from George Bernard Shaw. Upon hearing that the Honorable Joseph Burgess had resigned his seat in Parliament rather than compromise on an important issue. Here's what he said. When I think of my own character, smirched with compromise, rotted with opportunism, mildewed by expediency, dragged through the mud of borough council and Battersea elections, stretched out of shape with wire pulling, putrefied by permeation, worn out by 25 years pushing to gain an inch here or straining to stem a backrush. I do think Joe might have put up with just a speck or two on those white robes of his for the sake of the millions of poor devils who cannot afford any character at all because they have no friend in Parliament. Oh, these moral dandies, these spiritual toughs, these superior persons. Who is Joe anyhow that he should not risk his soul occasionally like the rest of us? And I buy that. I chaired the Foreign Operations Subcommittee for 10 years. In the 10 years before I chaired that subcommittee, the House only passed that bill through the House twice. After I chaired it, we passed it 8 of the 10 times. I could never have passed any of those bills without compromising, hundreds of compromises, not just with the other side of the aisle, but internally within our own party. And I rapidly learned that if you want to be an effective chairman, yes, you can try to push your own views, but in the end, your primary responsibility to the institution is to see to it that you get the work done. And to do that, you've got to find that point of equilibrium which can bring you to 218 and hopefully gives you some bipartisan support for whatever you're dealing with. But the pressures on politicians these days, as Jim says, the pressures against compromising are fierce. And if you take a look at what the situation is in Washington and who are players and who are not, that gets me to my next point about what the general public needs to do in order to deal with the issue of civility. First thing they need to do is to be much better informed than they are today. There are 300 communities in this country who used to have reporters covering the Congress 5 years ago who don't anymore because of the economics of the news profession, which has really shredded newspapers all over the country. For the life of me, I think it is incredibly difficult for the average citizen in an average-sized town to get enough information through news sources on a daily basis to be able to make an informed choice about policy and about who they're going to vote for in the next election. It is very, very difficult for them, given what's happened there. And then you have the 24-hour news cycle. And I kiddingly say that what happens Well, first of all, with the 24-hour news cycle, there's very little discrimination. You can have one story of major import running, and then 2 minutes later, you can have, something about a Texas cheerleader, and you don't have a process by which the important is separated from the non-important. And people also wind up listening primarily to television news with which they already agree. So if you're a conservative, you watch Fox. If you're a liberal, you watch Rachel Maddow. And if you don't know what you think, you watch CNN. And the problem is there's no cross-fertilization, because in order to intelligently understand these issues, you need to know what the other arguments are and what the other side is. And if you're only watching the news that fits into your own comfort zone, you're not helping the country very much. And then if you take a look at the pressures in Congress today, there are 514 organizations who are just listed by the National Journal as being trade groups and lobby groups that have more than $10 million in revenue. And all of them are scrambling for a piece of every legislator, a piece of every agency in town. And a huge percentage of those people are paid well over $2 or $3 million a year if they had those associations. And the vast majority of them certainly make over $500,000 a year. Do you think they're rewarded on the basis of how eager they are to compromise? I don't think so. And so that's also a problem. So basically, I guess what I am trying to say is that it is important that people understand that, yes, it's nice to have legislators respond to your own personal desires, but everybody in this system needs to be adult, both the practitioners and the consumers in a democracy, because it's important for the benefit of the country that people occasionally think of interests beyond their own. So I've had a sign hanging in my office for years, and I get people coming in my office every day asking for something. Usually it's money. And when they come in, I usually make them read the sign. The sign says, "Is there something you want me to do for somebody besides yourself that's more important than whatever it is you want me to do for you?" Because if people don't think that way, they're a menace to the system. And so that's, I think largely we have to look inward to try to figure out what each of our responsibilities are in making this a more civil and a more workable democracy. And one last thing. Jim, again, talked about dangerous people always being so sure of their own position. Eric Sevareid, the great commentator for CBS News, said once that it is absolutely crucial for us to be able to hang on to our doubts in an age of dangerous certainties. And I think that's a good lesson, both for politicians and for citizens in a democracy. Now, you don't have to agree on everything. One of my favorite quotes is from Will Rogers, who said, "When two people agree on everything, one of them is unnecessary." But the fact is, you do need to have enough self-restraint so that you find areas of agreement. And you do need to try. The other thing that bothers me is that members of Congress, I think, know each other much less well than they did when I went to Congress 40 years ago. Members of Congress used to, most of them used to bring their families to Washington. And so they'd travel home on weekends, but often they would have dinner at another member's house over a weekend. And often it would be across the aisle. The problem is that, if you know somebody well, and if you know you're going to see their spouse and their kids on Saturday night, it's a little harder to kick the hell out of them on the House floor that day. So it's important that you get to know each other. One example, when Tip O'Neill was Speaker and Bob Michael was the leader of the Republican Party, they took a month in August, and they and their wives traveled all around Africa. They learned about all kinds of problems in a variety of countries in Africa. And in the process, they got to know each other a heck of a lot better, too. And they developed a much better working relationship than they had before that. And in 1982, when Bob Michael was in political trouble and was afraid he was going to lose the election, Tip O'Neill raised money for him. Can you imagine what would happen today if any of the leaders did that? Instead, in the Senate, you had examples where the majority leader or the leader of one party would go into the state of the leader of the other party and try to beat him. Human nature being what it is, you're not likely to want to work very well with somebody who is going out of his way to lick you. I mean, the campaign committees are supposed to do that job. Individual members should not be doing that to emphasize it, as far as I'm concerned. So those are just some of my random thoughts. And I guess the other thing I would simply say is that there's something else that changed in politics, which is why I've come to the point I was making earlier, why I'm no longer convinced that this decline in civility is just cyclical. Because there's nothing new about the effort of people with a lot of money to try to control government. I mean, that's been going on for as long as you've had government. But there is something new today, because for the first time, they may be able to do it. And that's because of the Supreme Court decision that said that any corporation in this country can spend whatever they damn well please, anonymously, under the table. Nobody knows about it. Nobody knows where the money's coming from. And that really means that it makes, that means that you get one company angry, they can spend $10 million against you if they want, and the public won't even know it's happening. That is going to make democracy a whole lot sicker. And if you think you've seen a lot in this election, with all of these ads being run, you ain't seen nothing yet, because most of these corporations haven't been lawyered up yet. And once they are, you'll see a huge amount of money pouring into campaigns. And we'll be back to the good old days when like we had in the 19th century, when senators were regarded as being the agents of different industries from their own states, and they were even often on the payroll. And the problem when you have that kind of money that can pour into the system at any moment, that means that politics will have become what a lot of people have cynically thought it was for years. And that's the worst thing we can do if we want to serve our democracy, because the more cynical you make the American people by the way the system performs, the more difficult it will be to reach the kind of democratic judgments that we need to reach in a decent democracy. Thanks.
Congressman Leach, I too have been worried about about language that we use, and I was thinking about secession and how disturbed I was when Governor Perry mentioned secession, until I realized that we got Jim and Kathy Veninga out. And my next thought was, okay, I'll help you pack. Actually, I want to talk about what makes a politically healthy community. And my profile of a politically healthy community evokes a kind of Eden of a democracy that is an object of longing and, I think, nostalgia, whose contours became more vivid to me the longer I served in office. A politically healthy community is one where all of the citizens have a possibility of thriving. And in that sense, I think we cease to look for ways to eliminate poverty because it's such an inadequate political construction as a measure of our success, and instead look to define prosperity at its minimum as a goal for every community member. And I understand that goal of prosperity to mean the ability to feed, clothe, house, educate, and nurture your family, and then have some measure of capital left to give to your community and make a contribution. To ensure that all citizens can develop their unique gifts and offer their best contribution to support a clear vision of the common good, there needs to be first a strong system of public education, opportunities for continuing education as adults, and a well-equipped and accessible public library system. These are the incubators of that individual capacity that spawn a higher level of civic engagement. And then if a community is to draw successfully on its talent and engage it in public decision-making around issues, we need to hold public service in high esteem and afford dignity to those who hold public office. In that same system, there's a high level of representatively diverse participation in partisan political parties, full ballots, and contested races at every level. That community has to boast a healthy nonprofit sector that seeks innovation and partners with government appropriately without supplanting a democratic government's essential functions. Leaders in a politically healthy community champion a diverse culture, develop the security of mutual respect by focusing on the public agenda, always as a vision for the common good, and encourage inquisitiveness and creativity and self-reliance among community members. And that leadership in the schools and local government and in the nonprofit sector cuts across socioeconomic levels. It's renewed continually with systematic recruitment and development that reflects the diverse needs and perspectives. And it propels local talent to state, national, and international stages with innovative ideas and models that emerge in that rich matrix of talent. And that leadership in a politically healthy community models civility and nurtures and insists on the integrity of the community and of its public debate, and eschews the us versus them dichotomy that would create fissures within the community. A politically healthy community has strong cultural definition. It enjoys shared community pride in its history, its monuments and artifacts, natural resources, and a continued high quality of life. And its operations stem from an ethos of generosity and equal opportunity, a deep public value of diversity and robust institutional structures and habits that foster cooperation and collaboration between organizations in the public and private sector. And this community is sustained by a free, open, and politically astute press corps whose work is grounded in a strong ethic of civic responsibility and integrity. And the press is adequate to provide in-depth coverage of the issues and activities of the community, encouraging and demonstrating a varied and skilled approach to community problem solving. A high percentage of that community is connected, awash in a free flow of ideas, moving among a variety of media. A politically healthy community, in fact, defines its wealth in ideas, in new technologies and products that enrich the economy, but also in ideas that are embodied in the customs and institutions, in the ordinances that evolve with and reflect the community as a healthy place for investment and for talent to grow. And a politically healthy community provides its members economic security and physical safety. Good low-income housing stock, public transportation are available, law enforcement has a respected and trusted presence, and a high percentage of locally owned businesses operate successfully in a fluid economy. And as many of you here who know me know, I believe that the arts and humanities form the cultural infrastructure of a civil society and therefore of a politically healthy community. A democracy cannot flourish without them. They provide the creativity and spontaneity and sense of freedom necessary to fuel the ongoing struggle that is a democracy. A politically healthy community then invests in the arts to ensure the contexts and conditions that will make it robust and prosperous. Cornel West recently said that he saw the state of rights and fairness and equality today as hope on a tightrope. I have a little more optimistic view now that we have opened the doors to this UW Center for Civic Engagement.
I think my friend Brett Barker is going to speak about the history of public discourse, and I think when you get done you'll realize I came from a prior century than my colleagues here from state and federal government. It's a very nonpartisan level of government, and what I'm happy to report here at county government, civility is not on the decline, I think it's on the incline. I've worked for Marathon County for 23 years, and every year I see a more thoughtful, more engaged community and more informed board. So there's a lot of positive things happening. Those of you that aren't aware how county government's organized here in Marathon County, we have 38 board members. Typically we'll have an election that run nonpartisan and 8 of them will be challenged. So it's not like state government or federal government. There are no political ads. Very few of them put a sign out. A couple do, but not very many. So there are really not very many contested cases. And we have 52 committees that county board's members serve on. I'm the manager of the staff, and I report to all 38. And as you can imagine, when that job was open, there were less than 38 candidates. Because that's quite a task, but actually it flows relatively easily. I think we've discovered some things that work, and I just want to talk about our county budget this year as kind of an example of some of the things that work. Next Thursday, I'll be meeting at Rib River Ballroom, and I'll give my 11th presentation on the county budget. I've talked to the Rotary twice, the Optimists, the Shriners, all those groups. I was at Eastern Towns. I drove out to the eastern part of the county. I knew I went too far when the sign said Shawano County. And talked to people who typically aren't talked to much about government. I don't know how you can think people are going to participate if they don't understand it. My presentation is typically the same. I first of all ask them how large they think the county budget is. And you heard earlier it was $160 million, but most people guess, oh, $20 million. Okay, and I'm tell them that, you know what, the budget's going to be smaller next year than it is this year, but you should still be able to do a lot of good with $160 million in a community like this, shouldn't you? So everything doesn't have to be viewed through the lens of resource scarcity. We talk about police officers. I ask people how many police officers they think are on the road any time in this large geographic county. The typical answer is 12. Well, there are 5. People are interested to know that. There's just a lot of interesting discussion that can occur when people actually have the facts. Because when I go into the discussion, what people know is what they read in the newspaper, and kind of they know that. Okay, they know the controversial part, but what I did this year with the budget was I actually sat down before the first release with the editors of all the newspapers and gave them the facts as best I could, so that they could communicate to the public exactly not only what the issues are, but what the facts are. What are the how big is the budget? Where does the money come from? You know, one of the issues that comes up all over again is, if I ask people what is a major funding source for the county, they think it's property taxes, and they're 30% right. Mostly it's a state agency, and we talk about things like that. It strikes me that you cannot have an active, engaged democracy if people don't have the opportunity to speak to people and understand the facts. One of the things I often say during the presentation, I have the strongest feelings about the things I know the least about. Once you start to learn a lot about it, all of a sudden it gets pretty complicated, and I'll move on to something else. And so will they. Some of the things that we have in place that don't really work, or I don't think they work, I don't think public hearings really work. You know, I see the board, we do it because it's required by a lot of grants, and we sit there like a panel like this, and people tell us stuff. But we didn't give them enough information to participate. So they say something, and we say, well, okay, that's interesting if your facts were right, but they're not. So what we need to do is come up with a way that they can get those facts and they can participate. Because here's the mental model that I have is the people of Marathon County, they're the owners. They're represented by the group they chose, the 38 board members. That's their owner representatives, and I am their servant. It's not about me. It's about the owners, and they're not customers either, they're owners. And the owners ought to have great input into the decisions that we make. We have to come up with vehicles if we expect legitimacy, if we expect support for the decisions that we make to go forward. One of the things I think is really important is really the relationship with the media. And I think it's easy to berate the media and say that the media is only, we don't have Fox News here. Not that they would know who I was. We don't have that kind of media. Really what we have is the Wausau Daily Herald, the Record Review, the local radio stations, and they give people the impression of what's going on. If they don't give the facts, at least give an impression. And one of the things I think we've learned in government is that we need to be more conscious about helping them communicate a positive, accurate message about what's actually going on. If we try to move the reporters away and try to minimize our contact with them because we see them as somebody who's going to write something negative, that's what we get. So to really be able to explain to the community using the media, I think, is a critical skill that we need to develop better. One of the other things that I'm personally committed to is really when there is disagreement, and I'm sure some of you know there's a disagreement going on now called the aquatic therapy pool, and I'm attached to that, and what it really is a program decision the board's going to make. And when people are upset with me, what I tell them to do is the best vehicle that we have right now is to contact the county board supervisor that represents your district. I think coming to meetings is great. I think writing letters is great. But the most important vehicle is that one-on-one contact where you can articulate your reasons and the board supervisor has the opportunity and the time to tell you a little bit more about it and to give you an impression, at least, as to how they're thinking about that issue. I'm going to wrap this up pretty quick here, but if we don't maintain the connection, we're going to break down. We have to manage that connection to regular people, not just the Rotary Club, but we have to find opportunities to talk to labor unions, to talk to people who are otherwise disenfranchised from maybe some of the larger systems, and explain things in context that they can understand. Take the time and have the patience. The other is don't expect them to draw an opinion right away. I think there's a sense right now that you have to decide right this minute. I think really when you actually converse with regard to an issue, I learn more from the person who's objecting than the person who's agreeing with me. And a lot of times we'll get a call back and somebody will say, well, did you think about that? And the answer is, no, I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really good point. Where does this take us in the future, and what kind of community do we want to be? It strikes me that we have, right now in Marathon County government, a community that's healthy. I think we have leaders that take on the role. Not everybody's perfect. Not every issue gets well resolved. But I think we're learning as we go along, and I think that really if we continue on the track, we're going to have to think about some new things. Now, I don't know that I'm going to be the leader on this, but there are a lot of younger people here. They're not coming to the Rotary Club. We're going to have to learn to use social media. And I'll bet we have some employees in our staff that can help us do that, but I'm not going to be one of them. But, we need to learn to talk a new language. We need to learn to enroll people in the community into local government, where decisions we sometimes we get so self-important, like they're so complicated and they're a blizzard of acronyms. But here it's really not rocket science. It's really pretty simple. You have so much money to spend. You got some requirements from the state that you have to do things, but actually not as many as you'd think. And mostly it's what do we want to, as purchasing agents, the board is a purchasing agent on behalf of the community, want to purchase. Okay, well, I'm going to close there. Thank you.
Okay, I was asked to speak tonight to give a historical perspective on the question of American political culture and civility. And I thought about that, and I also thought about asking a historian to sort of sum up a large topic in 10 minutes and realized that that's quite a task if you know a historian. But I'll try to keep it within those limits. Also, if you are an academic or know one, you'll also know that you won't be startled by my conclusion that the question of civility in American politics is a little more complicated than it appears at first. And so I want to really talk about two things tonight. When I look back at the American past, I want to talk about the different ways in which political culture can lack civility. One way that I think is almost inevitable and maybe does not erode democracy, and one that I'll argue is dangerous to the democracy that we hold dear. As Brad suggested, my examples tonight are going to come from before 1920, a place where intellectually I reside much more comfortably than in the modern maelstrom of partisan politics. And yet in the end, I will have something to say about modern politics. First of all, I'd like to talk about a myth, a persistent myth that a lot of people like to hold dear. And it's this, that somewhere in the distant, hazy past, American politics was largely free of mudslinging and negative campaigning. This simply isn't true. Let me share just a few examples. In Thomas Jefferson's second year in the White House, a newspaper editor named James Callender was already making open accusations that the president had fathered children with one of his female slaves, Sally Hemings. I need hardly explain in great detail that such a charge was politically explosive in the United States of that time. Later in the 1828 presidential election, pitting John Quincy Adams against Andrew Jackson, I would argue that the nasty politics of that campaign has never been exceeded in a political presidential campaign to this day. Why? John Quincy Adams was accused while ambassador to Russia of giving an American servant girl to the Tsar to satisfy his carnal desires. His enemies loved to label him a pimp and said that he used public monies while in the presidency to install gambling devices in the White House. It was later determined that he had used his own money to purchase a pool table and a chess set. And yet I would argue that what was said about Andrew Jackson in that campaign was even worse. In pamphlets called coffin handbills, his political opponents said that as an American general, instead of being famous for being the victor over the British at the Battle of New Orleans, what he should be famous for was his love of executing deserters from the militia who hardly understood the rules and who didn't even know that they had broken them. But Andrew Jackson loved to hold a quick court-martial, and this was the inevitable result. They also said that his wife Rachel was a bigamist, a charge, it turns out, that was technically true, but not because she thought so, but because she had been told that her earlier divorce from her first husband was finalized when she married Andrew Jackson, when in fact it was not. But that was more a case of frontier poor paperwork than any attempt by Rachel Jackson to be a bigamist. In 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates occurred. And so they're the sort of things that are commemorated on United States postage stamps, right? In many ways, the highlight of American political oratory. And indeed, in some ways, they were. But that's a different talk. What I really want to focus on today is much of the rhetoric that Stephen Douglas used against Abraham Lincoln. Again and again in those debates, Stephen Douglas said that Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery because he wanted to marry a black woman. In fact, he made that charge so often that Lincoln was forced to say during the debates, "Because I would not have a woman as a slave does not mean I would take her as a wife. I could just leave her alone." So, indeed, perhaps what we should be nostalgic about in the Lincoln-Douglas debates is that in 1958, on its 100th anniversary, first-class postage was still 4 cents. To go a little further along, in 1884, Grover Cleveland was running for president. And it was reported correctly that he had fathered an illegitimate child. So political cartoons like this graced the debate that year, with the child saying, "I want my pa," and supporters of Cleveland's opponent, James Blaine, chanting in the streets, "Mama, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." In response, Blaine's opponents chanted, "Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, continental liar from the state of Maine." Both of those charges were true. Blaine was not known for his honesty in public office. And yet, in the end, in 1884, people went to the polls and they voted more based on their thoughts on the gold standard, or tariffs, or civil service reform, or land policies, and not on the sexual dalliances of one of the candidates for president. If you've been disillusioned by my brief whirlwind tour through the American political past and the fact that mudslinging has been an ever-present part of the American past, I have good news for you. In all those cases, despite all that mudslinging, despite all of that negative campaigning, democracy flourished. The 19th century was a time of incredible voter turnout. In many elections, over 90% of the eligible voters showed up for every election, not just the presidential election. People were interested in public debate. In one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, several thousand Illinois residents stood in a cold rain for 3 hours to hear two men debate the issues of the day. So mudslinging and negative campaigning has probably always been here and will always be here to stay. But in the second half of my remarks, I want to talk about a more dangerous trend in American politics in the past. For there is also peril. At certain moments in our history, a change in the way political opponents were viewed has imperiled that American democracy. It has threatened to move us away from a nation of laws and liberty to one of intolerance, hatred, repression, and ultimately violence. When opponents are just wrong, then democracy muddles along amid mudslinging and debate. But when opponents are not wrong, not just wrong, but are evil and become the enemy, the democratic process begins to break down. The two examples that might come to mind immediately in the American past are the American Revolution and the Civil War. In each of these cases, Americans went to war to break away from those they feared, thought evil, and felt they could no longer coexist with peacefully. These are, for good reason, two of the central moments in our nation's past. But let me suggest that there are other examples, more subtle, but no less important. One sure warning is the outbreak of violence in the halls of Congress. In 1798, Matthew Lyon, a Democratic Republican, and Roger Griswold engaged in the activity pictured quaintly here. They became so enraged at each other that they went for instruments in the fireplace in the halls of Congress and began to attempt to brain each other until other people could separate them. This was followed quickly by the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Sedition Act of which, of 1798, made it illegal to oppose any measures of the government or to bring into disrepute the President of the United States. One New Jersey Democratic Republican editor was jailed when he came out of a tavern, having enjoyed a few refreshing adult beverages, and looked and saw that they were about to issue a cannon salute for President Adams. Of course, when they do a salute, they don't actually put cannonballs in, as the results would be tragic. Instead, they just stuff the cannon with wadding. And Luther Baldwin said that he hoped that a piece of the wadding would lodge in the president's ample posterior. Luther Baldwin went to jail for that comment. Another example of violence breaking out. Oops, went the wrong way. Continued to go the wrong way. See, someone warned me, never use a PowerPoint because if if you don't know the technology. Here we go. Okay. Another example was the caning of Charles Sumner on the Senate floor in 1856. He was caned by a man named Preston Brooks from the House of Representatives, who felt that Sumner had attacked the honor of the South, and particularly his uncle, who happened to be another senator. He came up behind Charles Sumner as he sat on the floor of the Senate and began to hit him over the head with a cane made of gutta percha, a hard kind of plastic material that I can best describe as what bowling balls might be made out of an extremely hard plastic. He hit Sumner many times over the head, broke the cane. Sumner fell to the ground, not quite perhaps with such grace as is projected here, but he fell and was severely wounded by the attack. And again, to see how poisonous the political atmosphere had become, Massachusetts, where Sumner was from, chose to leave his Senate seat open for 2.5 years while he recovered. And so Massachusetts had only one vote then in the Senate during that time period. The response in South Carolina, where Preston Brooks was from, was quite different. He resigned from the House, went back to South Carolina, and was reelected without opposition. Perhaps more astoundingly, canes began to arrive in the mail. My favorite one was one that had a small little plaque on it that said, "Hit him again," but it was in Latin, because of course that's classier in Latin. But I think it does show just how divisive the political atmosphere had become, and indeed the Civil War was just a few years away. The idea of opponents being the enemy and of being dangerous also came up in World War I. There was another Sedition Act, which again made it illegal to oppose the war effort and oppose government policies. People like Eugene V. Debs, who spoke openly against the war, and particularly against recruitment, and wanted to go to jail, in some ways as a test case, were jailed, but so were other people. A man who made a movie called The Spirit of 76 was sentenced to jail time because in that film he had shown Americans firing at the British, who of course were our allies in World War I. But of course, any movie about the American Revolution is likely to show Americans firing on the British. Along with that, many of you may know, being from Wisconsin, that there was also an anti-German crusade. One man was actually jailed in the United States for including works of Beethoven in a symphony's repertoire, because Beethoven, of course, was German and therefore was a dangerous enemy. And of course, some of you might know that this went further. This is from Life magazine in 1917. The person on the left is the Kaiser. The person on the right is none other than Robert La Follette. La Follette's opposition to entry into the war and to some of the measures of that war made him an enemy in the eyes of even such a magazine, such an instrument as Life magazine. So, when the opponent is not just wrong, but they are dangerous, they are the enemy, they are evil, American democracy is endangered. So what does this say to me? It tells me that a healthy democracy demands that thoughtful citizens and their political representatives speak out when they don't agree with what's going on, especially in politics. That they offer constructive alternatives, but that they engage in the business of democracy. But the challenge in preserving the American experiment is to dare to take a step back from the spirals of inflamed rhetoric, the voices of hatred and division, and realize that while those we disagree with might be wrong, they are rarely evil and almost never our enemy. This history proves that the future of the Republic does not depend on the permanent or even repeated triumph of any one political agenda or viewpoint. It depends rather on all of our continued commitment to participation in this messy, frustrating, contentious, and ultimately beautiful process we call American politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you very, very much. Before we open this up for dialogue, I would just like to ask the members of the panel if anyone wants to respond to another person or another presentation? Do you all have any comments at all that you want to make at this time? Okay. We're going to open this up then. We have several people with microphones here, and actually what I would like to do, since a question came up earlier over dinner, and I would like to call upon Carla here to ask the question. So could we have a mic down here at the front? Ann? And I believe it has a question addressed to Chairman Leach.
Thank you. Is this working?
Yeah.
I'm a former high school English and history teacher. And as you well know, the basis of public education is education to be a citizen, among other things. And an area of great concern to me of late is that many schools are not teaching civics per se. It's not, I think this may be an unexpected development of not being tested. And so therefore, the measure of that, well, we've had many references to people not understanding their particular local government or really understanding how the government works at all. And so the question to you, Congressman Leach, is, do you think that the National Endowment for the Humanities would consider undertaking a national, as part of a humanities agenda, a national program of civics education in the public schools? And from what I'm hearing this evening, maybe even on the community level.
Sorry, that was a test. Can you hear me? Well, first, I think you're right in your premise that whenever you design tests and you limit what you're designing your tests for, everything else falls through the bucket. Now, it isn't just civics, and so I want to be careful about this. Those that are interested in the creative arts have much to be concerned about. And when you talk about civics, I sometimes think that if you're saying, how do you put yourself in someone else's shoes, maybe drama is more important than a civics course. But there is a dilemma when you do the statistics and what America knows about our history. There's a dilemma of what one knows about how our system works. My own view is history may be more important than the system, but there should be something about the system too. Now, you have a very interesting question. Should the National Endowment for Humanities take on an undertaking of a magnitude you mentioned? Frankly, we don't have the resources to do it. On the other hand, it is an interesting phenomenon on thinking through what kind of model programs can be developed, or perhaps one might describe it as what kind of curricula can be developed that might be very helpful for schools to undertake. And that is the kind of thing that I think an institution like the National Endowment could well undertake. And I will tell you that you're not alone in your concerns in this, and this is a matter of some discussion at the moment. But we're not in a position to be able to go to every school district in America and fund a program. We're about 1/1000 of 1% of the federal budget, and so it's a fairly de minimis institution. But I think in terms of advocacy, in terms of model development, that's a very appropriate undertaking.
Okay. Shall we open it up here then for questions? We have one in the back there.
Yes, I'd like to pose a question to either Jim Leach or Dave Obey, and that would be perhaps somewhat theoretical, but that's what we're here for. Do you feel that it would be possible to have government control the airways of television and radio to some extent, in giving free airtime to political candidates that got, say, for example, at least 15% of the vote in the previous election, their party. And this might diminish the constant need to raise funds for political ads, and it might level the playing field a little bit for those candidates that are multimillionaires and can spend their own money on advertising to become elected. Is there any way, maybe we can't do this, but I thought maybe since the airwaves are supposed to be controlled by some agency, is it possible to get some of the airtime as free airtime for major party candidates?
Well, actually, this is an idea that's been around for a long time. This has many advocates. By the same token, with each passing year, it becomes more complicated and slightly less realistic. For example, when you had only 3 national networks, one could visualize that happening. Now you have many more circumstances that are much more complicated. Now, speaking personally, I have to be careful about advocating political issues from my particular post, so I want to put this in a historical perspective. As a member of Congress, I used to advocate very strenuously what I call partial public of federal elections, where small contributions could be matched for any candidate of any party up to a given point in time, with the circumstance not triggering in until a minimum amount had been raised, and then a maximum amount at the other end. Now, there are those that favor full public financing of elections, but going to partial public financing is designed to fit your objective, but there are a number of reasons it doesn't fit every part of America. Let's say David has a district with 1 television market. It might fit him a little bit, but what happens in a district that there are 20 candidates in the same market? It doesn't fit so well. And so if instead you had a system of partial public financing, one candidate might say, I'm going to put all my money in television. Another candidate might say, I'm going to put all my money in the radio. Another candidate might say, I'm going to use the mails. Another candidate might say, I'm going to use the money for yard signs. And so it kind of becomes an individual discretion on how to apply resources, and that strikes me as a more realistic way. I will say that David commented earlier about a decision called Citizens United, which I consider to be, in a political sense, one of the least compelling Supreme Court decisions, certainly more than matched by the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which defined a part of the American population property. But this is one of the most bizarre decisions that was rooted in the notion that, in essence, money is the same thing as speech, and the notion that an individual is the same thing as a corporation. And if you take those definitional circumstances, if money is speech, that means you cannot curtail any use of money because that becomes a infringement of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And if a corporation is an individual, a corporation has the rights of an individual. And those are 2 premises that are really very interesting in a dictionary sense. Nowhere that I know of is there a dictionary that says money and speech are the same thing, or corporation and individual are the same thing. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that. Nowhere in the Federalist Papers is there a reference to that kind of circumstance. But based on it, we now have a system where some people are more equal than other people. That is, if you're a large corporation, you now are bigger than a smaller corporation, and you're bigger than an individual. But you're treated under First Amendment. There's nothing David as a legislator can do about it. unless the Congress of the United States actually changes or moves to change the Constitution in an amendment which takes the vote of 3/4 of states. And this is a real dilemma. And the problem with almost any other circumstance, for example, partial or public financing of elections is rooted in the notion that that's the only money that comes into a campaign, but it's irrational if corporations can give. And so what the Supreme Court has just done, whether you like my idea or not, it makes it irrational for it to be advanced. And that is, to me, an absolutely bizarre circumstance. And frankly, it makes less important any kind of approach if someone else can drown out the amount of money involved. But it's very difficult to simply say all of television has to give a given percentage of time to all candidates. And if you think about it, just think how many candidates there are. I mean, there'd be no way for anything to operate in some markets and to operate efficiently in most markets. And so that itself doesn't work as well as it might have 50 years ago, but it's hard to visualize working today.
I agree with absolutely every word that Jim has said on this. You cannot reasonably expect a solution such as you suggest to do anything except cause chaos, let's say in an urban market like San Francisco, New York, Miami, Atlanta, where you have multiple congressional districts within the same area. You'd be seeing nothing but free television to all the candidates, and you'd drive everything else off. I would also say that I think there is something fundamentally wrong when any outside forces can expend money outside of contributing directly to a candidate, because candidates should be held responsible for every ad that's run on their behalf. And when candidates' television ads, for instance, wind up becoming a minority of the dollars spent in any given TV market, because you've got the Citizens Council for Preservation of Sweetness and Light, who wind up pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars into a media market. We just had up in Superior, for instance, an outside group dumped $70,000 in TV ads on a legislator up there virtually overnight. And so if you want accountability, you need to have a system in which the only money that can be spent in elections is money that's spent directly through the candidate's treasury. The problem is the courts have ruled the other way, and they make that impossible. I am so tired as a member of Congress of trying to defend Congress for, when people think that we are, what people say is, oh, you guys are running under the laws that you wrote. No way, baby. I mean, we are running under the laws that the Supreme Court produced. And in the main, the law that they created shredded the reform efforts that Congress tried to pass on several occasions. So that is why, out of total frustration with the existing system, I've introduced legislation that would simply say that with respect to general elections, not a single dollar of private money can be spent in general elections. That what we should do instead is to create what would be called a grassroots democracy fund. And you would give the Federal Elections Commission the ability to run ads from January through April 15, telling people that this fund existed, and that if they wanted to take back their government, they could contribute to that fund, and then the money would be distributed by formula to each congressional district in the country. There's still a lot of problems with that, not the least of which is that you'd have to have a constitutional amendment in order to actually make it become law. But I think it is just incredible that we've turned elections into anonymous purchases by the decisions that the court has come down with.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? We have one in the back
I
here.
don't know for certain if that's the case, but that is really an astonishing thought.
Hi, thank you all for being on the panel. I appreciate it so much. Curious, talking about Citizens United, Dr. Barker, I was wondering could you give us some historical perspective on the kind of other campaign funding that we've seen in the past, and is this is this a new phenomenon? Is this kind of something that you can offer some perspective on? Thank you.
Well, in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. There you go. There goes that academic again. I would say that the way we see money, particularly with Citizens United, the ability to anonymously, we haven't seen that for a long time. I think Congressman Leach mentioned the 19th century, when indeed often legislators were controlled by large business interests. I mean, most famously, in the 1880s, a Pennsylvania legislator became so upset over the control of the state legislature by the Pennsylvania Railroad, they said, I move we adjourn unless the Pennsylvania Railroad has any more business it wishes to conduct. And so we have seen this before, but I think that the historical thing that's also changed is the way in which media, the costs of media have changed over time. In the 19th century, newspapers had clear-cut political affiliations. They were right on the masthead, who to vote for every issue. There was no question at all. And they were largely the way in which campaigns got their word out. And expenditures were nothing like they were today. That's not to say, again, that money didn't influence races, but I think that particularly, radio and then TV have really changed the economic situation. Certainly the money spent on campaigns is in many ways unprecedented.
And let me add that Jim just points out that Congressman Bruce Braley in Iowa, he just had $700,000 dropped into the campaign against him by outside groups who simply want to take him out and can do it anonymously. One of the reasons that I just said forget it and that I decided to quit is because I detest what is happening with money in politics. When I first got elected, I spent about $45,000 to get elected to the Congress. When I got elected to the Assembly, I spent $1,160. $500 was Jones and my own money. And that was all the money we had in the world. We thought it was a lot of money then. I mean, my God, you take a look at the cost of the races. When somebody drops $300,000 into the race against Decker here in town, I never spent in the Assembly more than $5,600 in the 4 campaigns I waged. And when I ran for Congress, I spent $45,000. My opponent spent about $65,000. And today you can bet that the campaign for each of the candidates to succeed me will be well over $1.5 million. And when so much of that money comes in outside of the campaign treasury, I was lucky because I never had to pick up the phone and ask somebody directly for a campaign contribution. I was lucky enough to be able to get by having it hired, so I'd have somebody making calls on my behalf. That would not be possible for me anymore, and I just don't want to run under those circumstances.
In the far back there, too?
The word democracy originates from 2 Greek words, demos and kratos. Demos means people, kratos means power. The power of the people has been kidnapped by the political system, the judicial system, and economic giants of the country. Only 2 of the speakers tonight actually addressed themselves directly to the word democracy, demos kratos, the power of the people. One was Dr. Barker, who spoke about people's knowledgeable participation in the voting process and the election process. And the most pointed reference to democracy was by Mr. Karger, who spoke correctly in saying that the power is in the people. The people are the owners of the county. The people are the owners of the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Some comments or observations?
I'd like to respond very directly. Let me first say, when David and I spoke about the Citizens United case and the definition of an individual and a corporation being the same, that is speaking directly to your issue, because the great American Revolution, which was an idea and ideal, was all about governmental legitimacy springing from the individual. And when you define a corporation as an individual, you are turning upside down the whole concept of democracy. Now, I also tie this very definitively to the concept of civility. If civility means one individual willing to listen to another individual respectfully and willing to put themselves in another's shoes, and then you have a system in which large money comes into the process, and a legislator becomes indebted, that means that there is no civility between the citizen and the legislator, because the legislator's ears are filled with wax in relationship to a corporation speaking to the legislator, to whom the legislator might be indebted. And this is really all about democracy. And what's at issue today is the nature of American democracy. Now, you can go further in taking money outside of this. The American system was rooted in the notion of human nature. Our founders were moral philosophers as well as political philosophers. And because they were so concerned that man was vulnerable, they had to establish a separation of powers doctrine. And that became true as foreigners realized at the legislative, executive, judicial level to hold power accountable, because power is what you're talking about. We also quadruplicated this. We put this at the state level, we put it at the county level, we put this at the city level. And so America was designed in the notion of holding power accountable to individuals. And if it's held accountable to individuals, there is no place for outside kinds of activities. Now, one thing David talked about outside of money that is really important, he talked about rules. That is, where in the Constitution does the Senate suggest that it ought to have a 60 vote margin? Where in the Constitution does it say a Senate can hold up any nomination, any bill? One senator. And these are process issues that this country has to think about. And they relate to the people, and they relate to the process and power. And I really love your premise about the root of the word democracy, because that's what's at issue today. And it's process, it's power, and then it's empowerment of individuals. I personally think that every tea-timer in this country ought to share with every libertarian and every liberal concerned that big interests are taking control of the American political process, and that the process itself is being jeopardized by the arrogance of some of the rules of the United States Congress. And if you're going to bring power to people, among other things, Senate rules disempower the House of Representatives, the People's Chamber, because it may act and the Senate be unable to act. It is just bizarre. And then you bring in the power of the outside money in this process, and you've got a system that becomes unaccountable to the individuals because of power relationships.
Amen.
How about a couple more questions here? Take John, and then we'll take Margaret here in the front, too.
I'd like the moderator to decide who should answer this question. A writer for Time magazine recently drove across the country and did an informal poll and found that people that he talked with over a couple of weeks were 20 times more likely to mention China than either Afghanistan or Iraq. My question is, As you look at our country, a capitalist democracy, and as you look at China as an authoritarian capitalist nation, one growing at 2% on a GNP basis, the other growing at 8 to 10%, what do the implications of China's economic growth and power mean for democracy as more and more nations are looking to China as a possible model for economic and political strength?
I'd like for both Dave and Jim to respond to that, since both have extensive experience in terms of both Soviet and Chinese history and contemporary life there.
Let me first ask, I heard all aspects of this question, of your premise, but not the exact question. Are you saying, is China a model we ought to be looking at, or are you saying, is this China a model that we ought to be concerned about? What was your question, the very last phrase?
The last words were, what are the implications for us as a democracy of this?
Well, I think they're enormous. And first, let me do one mathematical thing that most people don't think about. There's a rule of 72, which is that 10% doubles every 7.2 years. And that is dramatic. So when you have a country that is growing at 10%, and actually it's been growing at more than that, that means rates of growth are rather massive, and that they are changing the order of relationships in the world. Now, some aspects of that growth are worthy of respect, because we respect competition and we respect free markets. Some aspects are worthy of great rebuke, because we don't respect totalitarian or authoritarian means, and we don't respect when free markets are not free, in the sense that people are taking advantage, for example, of currency relationships, and are taking advantage of governmental intrusions to help one industry versus another. But this is a matter of great concern, and then how we deal with this century, it's a matter of concern that we want to have better relations with the world rather than less good. And so how the United States and China work out a relationship over this century is going to be the most important two-country relationship in the world, maybe for the next millennium. But some of what's happening in China we have to thoroughly respect, and some of what's happening in China we have to be very cautious and concerned about. And one of the things that we want to be particularly careful about is that we don't want a relationship of military antagonism to develop. I can't think of anything that would be more awkward is an understatement, more dangerous for the world than for the United States and China to have a military confrontation. And so some things we're going to want to work out, and in working them out, we're going to want to have some greater give and take, and mainly some give on the Chinese side from our perspective, but also the perspective of much of the world. In fact, you're seeing some of this discussed the last 2 or 3 days in these abstract lettered numerical meetings, the G20 meetings that are going on in Korea today. And this is all about a lot of countries in the world very concerned about the economic might and the way that might is developing and the way power is being abused. It's also being reflected in this Nobel Prize circumstance, where a dissident has been given the Nobel Prize for having the courage to stand up to the Chinese government. And these are things that all of us are going to have to look at and watch probably more carefully than anything. When David and I were growing up, the great challenge in the world was the Soviet Union. Today, it's oddly the power of China, and oddly the incredible power that we never looked at all of much smaller forces in the world, particularly because terrorism has become globalized, and frankly, there's nothing easier than to put off a small bomb anywhere, in any place, in any country. And so we have new types of challenges that all have to be looked at, China being one.
Let me simply say that I think one of the things that has plagued us for years has been that we have not known nearly enough about China. When I was studying the Sino-Soviet relationship in college, when I was sitting in the library reading everything I could get my hands on, it was obvious, given what I was reading, that you had had a tremendous split develop between the Russian and the Chinese communists. Part of it was related to doctrine, part of it was related to geopolitical interests. And yet our State Department had lagged for years in understanding what was happening as Russia and China moved further away from each other. That in part was caused by the Who Lost China frenzy that during the McCarthy days that resulted in a wholesale stripping of the State Department of people who knew what was going on in China. Now we've had to play a lot of catch up. Jim is right that the most dangerous thing that could happen in this world, outside of Pakistan going crazy, I suppose, would be if we were to develop a severe tension between us and China that would lead to the potential for military conflict. So our primary goal has to be to avoid that. But we also have some economic interests we have an obligation to defend. Example, the paper industry here in this area is interesting. About 15 years ago, I remember having a strenuous debate by some members from the Paper Council here in the Wisconsin River Valley, because I was expressing my concern about trade policy and about the Chinese practices with regard to trade. And the paper industry was saying to me, leave it alone, leave it alone. We sell lots of stuff in China. Leave it alone. Well, in the last 2 years, that same paper industry is now pursuing relief from the World Trade Organization, because China has been underselling American paper products and often selling them under cost in order to dump their surplus product. Same was true with Japan a few years ago. Martin Sable, who represents, or used to represent Minneapolis, Martin and I got involved in trying to respond to what the Japanese were doing. They were trying to undersell American computers on the supercomputers on the American market. And so we thought the evidence was pretty clear that Japan was selling these computers at under cost simply to drive a couple of American suppliers, including Cray, out of business. And since we both represented Cray, and that represented a lot of jobs, we pressed hard to have some action taken to rein in the Japanese. The Washington Post called my office, and they wanted to write an editorial about it. I thought, oh my God, we're going to get the usual, oh, these guys are nothing but protectionist editorials. Instead, to my surprise, pleasantly, they wrote an editorial saying, we're free traders, but in this case, Obie and Sable are right. We've got to look at this on a case-by-case basis, and where we have a strong case, we have to make the Chinese understand that if they want to play by free market rules, they need to play fair, and they need to actually develop a free market of their own, and they're a long way from that today. The only other thing I would say is that generally, what I think is important globally, it is astounding to me the way power is slowly but inexorably shifting from the West to the East. It isn't just China, it's also India. I mean, they're going to be two huge players worldwide in not too many years to come. And so we've got to develop constructive relationships with them and keep constructive relationships with them, but at the same time, we have an obligation to American workers and American business to see to it that whatever competition takes place is on the low.
Brett, you.
I just wanted to briefly say that I think when we're talking about what a healthy community includes, I think that the other challenge that faces us is I think the United States and its citizens can no longer afford not to be well informed about the rest of the world. I think that we have been very not aware of what's going on in other places around the world. We continue to be surprised when things flare up. And I think that the future of things like getting American students to know more than English, to be more aware of the world around them is another challenge that I think the United States cannot avoid much longer, because we are too interconnected with the rest of the world to simply not know the difference between Australia and Austria any longer.
Okay. Let's have one last question here. Margaret, you're fine? Okay, well, go ahead. You want to come down with the mic and we'll take your question.
I view the internet as being a great democratizing force, and my concern is that our cable companies and telecom companies do not see it that way. Concerned that they see it as more of a money-generating opportunity. I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you live in Europe or you live in some countries in Asia, you can get an internet line that is up to 10 times faster than anything you can get in America. And you don't have to pay as much for it there as we pay for it here. Now, I don't know when a large number of people here are going to wake up and realize that they're getting ripped off for their internet line. But two things strike me. One, there is no profit to be made in expanding internet access to rural areas. And two, there's no profit to be made in increasing everybody's bandwidth across the board. So my question is there support regarding making internet access into a public service for everybody?
Well, let me just quickly make one point. I'm no fan of the internet in a lot of respects, because I think that it has helped to destroy the newspaper industry. And I think that is a huge threat to American democracy, because there is much less information being imparted through newspapers to American citizens than you had in the past. And I'm very concerned about that. At the same time, I certainly recognize the need to have equal access to the internet. I took a lot of hell on the stimulus package, and I was the main sponsor of that package in the House. And I took a lot of hell on it from my political opponents, because they said, what on earth does internet have, or what does broadband have to do with creating jobs? And the fact is that I tried to explain that representing a rural district, I have black holes all over my district when it comes to that stuff. And so we put a number of billions of dollars, I've forgotten what the number was, into that budget to try to make up for the fact that the private companies didn't have any incentive to go out into the rural areas, just like the power companies didn't have any incentive to go into rural areas in the 30s, so we had to invent the REA. And so some of the same people who are screaming about the fact that we put too much money in the stimulus package for things like broadband, they're now squawking because, gee whiz, you really haven't created any jobs. And they will say, after all this money isn't being spent right away, why did you do this? We did it because on the stimulus package, we tried to deal with three problems simultaneously. We tried to deal with the victims of the recession by helping them out through things like unemployment compensation. We also tried to help on the short term create jobs by putting a lot of money into construction. People say that you didn't create a single job under stimulus. There are 20,000 transportation projects going on around this country right now, paid for by that package. And then thirdly, we tried to put money in what we consider to be the areas of the economy that have the greatest potential for creating long-term growth. And one of them is broadband, the other is the health professions, because even in the depths of the recession, we still had job growth in that area. And so you ask whether there's support for expanding that. It depends on who you talk to in the political system.
Barbara?
I would point out, I remember, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, visiting a village of Jackson, north of Milwaukee. And they were trying to be a small town with a global reach and be a town that had, the entire town would be Wi-Fi, et cetera, right? And they couldn't get the local companies or the companies that service that area to imagine how to do that with them. I think it was 2005, and they said, maybe we'll be able to accomplish this by 2010. So they decided to become their own utility. And were figured out that they could provide that to their residents at a savings of $500 per household per year by becoming a public utility to provide that. In the meantime, the companies, the cable companies, of course, went into high-test lobbying, and a bill was passed that made it nigh unto impossible for a municipality to become a utility for that.
Thank you. I think we need to bring this to a close, and I will do so, but I want to just very quickly ask one little question and see if we can get short responses to it, which has to do with this facility. All of us this evening are privileged to be here in this beautiful new building, in this theater, being used for the first time. And we hope that this facility will indeed benefit the campus in ways that we can't even conceive at this time. One of the goals is to somehow do what we can to connect students to public life, to be civically engaged. And I would just like for each of our panelists to comment just real quickly on what they hope this facility can do in terms of that civic engagement and involving students and faculty and staff. And maybe, Brad, why don't we begin with you and we'll come down.
Well, what I hope, and this is partly from a selfish point of view as a member of this campus, is that I hope that while this is the UW Center for Civic Engagement, I hope that this becomes a place where people from our community, from our city, from our county, and indeed from our state can come and talk about things that are important to all of us, and it just happens to be on the UWMC campus. I hope it's a place for all of us, not just seen as a place apart, because we want it to be. I think that's at the heart of the Wisconsin idea.
Brad?
One of the things that occurs to me, there was this really great discussion about China, and that is, how does a common person participate in any meaningful way in a discussion about China when they don't know much about it? And I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that there's a unique role for the public university. It's not just training traditional students. It's not just training the elite of our community. Is we have to have an opportunity to learn enough to participate in any meaningful way. You are not getting that from the debates that you hear. You are not getting that from the political ads. It's going to take really an opportunity to sit down, learn some of the issues, learn some of the dynamics. Otherwise, participation is really superficial.
Thank you. Barbara?
I love the two-year campuses because I love the essential relationship with the county government that insists that citizens are engaged with and understand the deep value of what happens here. So I hope that this building especially that holds such promise to have so many different kinds of ways to make a community comfortable coming into the doors of its university and building new ways of addressing ever more challenging issues that come before us. I hope that they teach the other campuses of this state how to work that way, how to engage a community.
Thank you. Dave?
Well, people often, when they talk about college towns, they talk about town and gown. And to me, I would like to see the two merge, because this facility, while it is located on campus, is not, in my view, meant to be exclusively a campus facility. It's supposed to be a facility located on campus, which is for the benefit of the entire community. And I would hope that what would happen here over the years is exactly what happened to me. I told the story earlier today about when I was a sophomore here, and after the Middle East War broke out in 56 or 57, I forgot which year it was. I think 56. We had a discussion that developed between two faculty members, Sam Weiner and Bob Najum, taking opposite sides of the issue on the Middle East, and what began as a simple conversation over lunch one day stretched out into a long series of discussions on the Middle East. And that piqued my interest tremendously, and it wound up being, for a long time, one of my principal focuses when I chaired the Foreign Operations Subcommittee for years. And I had a 20-year head start in learning about the Middle East before I became chairman, largely because my interest had been piqued by that conversation here so long ago. And I would hope that in the future you would have the same kind of stimulating actions going on, so that not just students on campus, but others would have their curiosity piqued and their interest piqued, and in the end become far more knowledgeable on issues like that because of the availability of this institution.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, maybe I should conclude as an outsider. This wonderful name, Center for Civic Engagement, means precisely that. Everybody in this community will figure this out far better than anyone from the outside can suggest. The second point I'd like to make as an outsider, I want to thank you all for the enormous courtesy in not inaugurating this center with today's Wisconsin football game.
Okay, thank you all. Let's thank our panelists. We have a reception in the foyer. Everybody's invited. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.